So we'll just give it a couple of minutes so more people can join before we kick it off. Okay, Oladeji, what do you think about starting?
Let's rock, yeah, let's do it.
Okay, cool. Okay, so as people are still trickling in, I just wanted to thank all of you for coming and attending this event. I'm very excited to present, the panelists and start this off soon. But before that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ADR Career Night, ADR Career Panel that we're hosting right now. This is dedicated to students who are interested in ADR, such as negotiation, mediation, and arbitration. And today's panelists will be talking about their own career experiences, utilizing these ADR techniques and skills. Welcome. This is an annual event, and this is the second time that we've hosted a virtual version of the event, which we hope makes it more accessible to people outside of just the law school community and makes it a little easier to fit into your schedules. I also wanted to give a short plug for the Harvard mediation program. I'm Jessica. I'm the continuing education director of the mediation program, and it's one of the ADR organizations at Harvard Law School. We train a cohort of mediators every year to mediate cases, which are mostly assigned to us by the courts around the Cambridge and Boston area. Some of the common topics we get are landlord-tenant disputes. We also have harassment prevention order training and a variety of other cases where that we need mediators for. Our basic training this year is happening in February on the weekends of February 5th and 6th and 19th and 20th. Where you will be learning the skills of, active listening, how to write a settlement agreement, and so on. And our applications will open again in the spring semester. So we look forward to seeing some of you there, hopefully. I also wanted to introduce our co-sponsors. Those are the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program, the HLS Negotiators, and the Negotiation Law Review, which are the other ADR organizations at Harvard. So we had all of their help in promoting and advertising this event. So now I want to introduce Oladeji Tiamiyu, who is going to be the moderator for tonight. He is a clinical fellow at the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. And he recently started a cool podcast called Convergence, which is about the negotiations, conflict management, and technology, which is very on point for people who are interested in ADR. So I would suggest all of you check it out when you have the chance. So Oladeji, on to you.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you so much for the kind introductions. And I also just want to really thank you for all the hard work you've done in organizing what is certain to be a really exciting panel. This evening, I do have this sincere privilege of moderating this panel. Each of the panelists have worked in alternative dispute resolution broadly, yet each of them are involved in this field from a slightly different perspective. They come from international peace-building initiatives, from within the educational sector, and also from within government work. So I'm really excited to hear from them and to learn from them about their insights, and also to explore how there are these multiple doors for entering a career in alternative dispute resolution. Before they introduce themselves, I did want to just go over briefly some logistical details. I'll be moderating this discussion for about 40-ish minutes until around 7:15. And then we will field questions from you all, our lovely attendees, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And throughout the panel session, you will inevitably have questions for this amazing panel. So I just invite all of you to drop those questions in the Q&A box below. And Jess will be tracking all the questions you ask, and then we'll circle back to them later on when the time is right. And then for the final minutes, there will be about 30 minutes or less where there will be a separate Zoom room so that you can interact directly with each of our lovely panelists. All right, so with that, maybe to just jump things off to our panelists, my question is relatively broad. So the first thing I wanted to hear from each of you is your names, where you're currently based in the world, and from your perspective, what the most rewarding aspect of working in alternative dispute resolution has been so far in your career. So that's the first round of questions, and I'm going to ask Jane to kick things off for us. Oh, you're on mute.
Right. You told me to mute and I forgot to unmute. Okay. Thanks for having me here. And we'll get into it in a minute, but one of your members of the audience was our intern last summer. So and he was great. So we're just kind of excited to be back. And anyway, my name is Jane Giuliano. I am located in Washington, D.C. I work for a very small federal government agency called the U.S. Office of Special Counsel. And the most rewarding part about doing ADR has been being a facilitator in people's lives, seeing them change for the good, being an active and significant part of it, at least at one point in time.
That's beautiful. Jason, what about you?
Hi, everyone, and thanks for everyone involved in organizing. My name is Jason Gelbort. I'm currently based in Chicago, but my work is all working with individuals and organizations in Burma or Myanmar and nearby areas, working on the situation there. I think what's most rewarding for me is I work on a highly complex multi-party conflict situation in that country, and it can be rewarding to help very diverse groups of stakeholders who have shared goals, but lots of challenges to help them build consensus and common understandings and shared strategies to try to get closer to advancing towards their goals, even though that can take a long time and face lots of challenges. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I mean, I can only imagine that it does indeed take a lot of time, even to just find what the common interests actually are. So he can even delve into that later on. Chandra, what about you?
So my name is Chandra Banks. I am currently the conflict mediator for the Cambridge Public Schools District. I've been there since 2006. And I have so many rewards in my job. I think the first thing that popped in my mind when you said that was when we had this really tricky mediation between a third grader and another third grader, and we had two seventh graders do the mediation. And I mean, it was so difficult. The third grader was crying so much. And then one of the seventh graders said, I understand, you know, let me give you this piece of paper and you could just write it down because talking and crying are very difficult. And she wrote her whole story down and they got an agreement, and one skipped off in one direction, the other one went in the other direction. And that's probably really rewarding to see seventh graders with they're so proud that they did that. So that's one of the things that I love. So that's just the first thing that came to my mind.
Thank you, Chandra. And Jerry.
Great, thank you for inviting me. Yes, I'm Gerry McHugh. I'm based in Cambridge. Normally, I'm splitting myself between my time in Cambridge and East Africa. We have an office in Nairobi. And I'm the founder and president of Conflict Dynamics, and we work on international conflict prevention and resolution. And within ADR, that would focus more on mediation support, consensus building, development of options around governance arrangements, things like that. Most rewarding. To me, we care and we were set up to prevent violent conflict, particularly. And most rewarding there are the situations where we really have helped prevent a war, support people in reconciling their differences, that they themselves can prevent violent conflict, or if it breaks out, to bring it to an end sooner. And we have some great examples of that. And just listening to Chandra, what's really one of those examples that sticks in my mind is that we work with young leaders in Sudan. And right now there's an ongoing or just recently occurred coup in Sudan. But to see people of a new generation coming and bringing their own ideas, their own approaches, and really for that, the most rewarding part is to see what we can do to support and let them be out in the front and lead. And that's a wonderful, rewarding thing to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. And I love how for each of you, the most rewarding aspect really does relate to one another. So it kind of illustrates whether it's witnessing the rewarding attributes of seeing people grow and building consensus, despite even how time-consuming the process can be to reach that consensus, but kind of devoting the time and the emotional skills so that you can reach that consensus as a rewarding aspect. And then Jerry, with what you shared around empowering people, I find to be really beautiful. And sometimes alternative dispute resolution can provide this, based on its name, alternative route, where people have more skin in the game to be involved in the conflict management process, something that courts might not empower them to the same extent with. So I think your answer, especially on this global level, kind of illustrates that power of alternative dispute resolution. So we see these through lines, and I guess for you all, you at some point in your lives, you were students, right? And so I'm a bit curious to hear about, while you were students and while you were potentially even learning about this field called ADR, what piqued your interest during that part in your life to explore this career further? And I guess, Jerry, since you ended things, why don't you start things this time? We can go in reverse order. Okay,
speaking of reverse order, before I became a student, I found myself working in Iraq, and unfortunately, that's have to date myself, that's 30 years ago. But essentially, I saw there the effects of the Iran-Iraq war, the campaigns in the north. And I honestly said, I can tell you, I said, there's got to be a better way to dealing with differences than what I saw in Iraq. And that absolutely put me on a path of saying, I don't know what that different way is, but it's not the way I'm seeing here in Iraq. I was working in a hospital there, and what I saw, I said, this cannot be it. And then that drove me to go back and become a student to learn more about how can you engage in conflict prevention and resolution. And very honestly, that has really stuck with me in these many years of seeing how can we bring approaches that really dig into the core of when people have differences, what brings them to either this translates into violent conflict. Again, this is an area we're very, very concerned about. So answer to your question, Oladeji, is that it even started before I went back to school in seeing firsthand, and because there's participants joining who are students, seeing firsthand and experiencing firsthand and getting out there and being in those environments, different cultures, that's a big part to me about understanding what is driving people, whether it's disputes or whether it progresses, unfortunately, to violent conflict.
Thank you, Jerry. And Chandra, you're up. Yep, thank you.
So we're gonna resonate again, and I'm gonna age myself as well. I'm gonna put a date. I was a student at Cambridge and Latin High School during the era when crack became a way to get out of the ghetto, per se. A lot of young people, my friends, started selling drugs because they were really, really poor. They actually were very poor, and they were really trying to augment the income of their families. And that turned, while I was in high school, into murder and girlfriends losing their boyfriends. I have some friends who were pregnant while their boyfriends got killed way back then. Their kids are like 30 years old, and those kids came back through the high school. And when I got my job that I have now, they said, where do you want your office to be? And I was like, can I have it at the high school? And so now I have my office at the high school, where I thought to myself, there has to be another way to do this. This is crazy. And I thought, I'm going to go and become a lawyer, and I'm going to defend kids to prove that they were only trying to not be poor. You know, they were really the poorest kids, and like people didn't understand why they did that. They just like, look, these kids are violent and they're trying to be rich. So that's what I wanted to do. But when I realized what the laws were, I said to myself, it's going to take me forever to change the laws in order to go to court and make this work. So I decided to not go to court ever and go through the schools and work with students who are experiencing behavior differences, shall we say. I was a top-down authoritarian disciplinarian until I learned about mediation and restorative justice. So I kind of went around, but I started just like you, Jerry, like, what the heck? I do not think that this is necessary. I felt like there's another way at a younger age, way before I kind of thought about a career. And here I am in the same building doing the same thing.
I guess I'm next. So I guess a little bit similar that my interest was first prior to going back to school as well, that but in a different way, that before going back to graduate school, I was working in international business strategy consulting, focused on sort of high stakes business to business negotiations. And it was really interesting. I worked across a lot of different industries. And then I went to HLS and to the Fletcher School, and wanted to do more public interest focused international work. And when I first went back to school, I wasn't sure exactly what type of work it was, but I did take courses that I think helped me sort of rediscover useful things about my previous or first career path. So I took a couple of the negotiation workshops at the law school, and I took a few really useful courses at Fletcher School, both in like international arbitration, which I never was involved in practicing, but it was useful to think about, and also conflict resolution theory and things like that. So academically, it was very useful. And then I think exploring different sort of summer opportunities was useful also to help me think about what I wasn't interested in. So I think that helped me see that I didn't want to go into litigation as well. And so those things together, I think, sort of helped me stay sort of focused on negotiations, but in a different way than how I started.
Should I go next then? Okay. So I didn't know that ADR existed when I was in law school. I know that's dating me, but it's the truth. I didn't know about it when I was a lawyer. I first heard about it. I've been a lawyer for a while. My nephew was in a peer mediation program at his elementary school, and that's how I first heard about it. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. I didn't even know Chandra back then, but I'm like, that's a good idea. And then some years later, I thought that my destiny was to be a trial lawyer. And so that's what I did for quite a while. There was some downsizing, and I was in a private firm. There's some downsizing there. And I started analyzing what I was good at. And I was thinking of several options, and I realized that the things that you had to do to be a mediator, the skills that you needed, were kind of my best skills. And so I started doing it on a volunteer basis while I was still lawyering. And then eventually I decided to start a practice in it, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I didn't come into it until I was more than 10 years into being a lawyer.
Cool, thank you. So this is once again going to this multi-door approach for accessing alternative dispute resolution, if you will. So as a career. So I think that's beautiful that each of you kind of came to this at different moments in your life as well. And with just about everything you each shared, there's this thread around exploring alternate routes to address those root causes in whatever issue you are identifying, but alternate routes beyond what is presented to you. And kind of a deviation from the norm or the status quo for what is the historical approach for addressing conflict. So I think that's a really important theme to just identify. And we are in this unique moment where, with the pandemic, where the status quo has been altered and shifted and thrown around and chewed up and spit back out. So because of the uniqueness of this moment, and because of how prolonged it is, I think it's a beautiful opportunity to also just reflect on the state of alternative dispute resolution, maybe to identify what the future could hold for alternative dispute resolution. And because each of you are celebrities, more or less, by definition of being on this panel, I'm sure you have crystal balls. And so I kind of just want to summon these crystal balls that you each have and ask, in your perspective, whether it's normative or just realist, what you believe the future of alternative dispute resolution in a post-pandemic world will look like. And we can do the reverse to the reverse order. So Jane.
Okay, all right. I'm thinking maybe the tech person should talk first, but I'll take a try. So, you know, the program I run is it's mediation of complaints filed with our agency, and they're basically employment issues, like a federal employee or applicant and their agency, and they can be anywhere in the country and also sometimes in other parts of the world where the U.S. government might or military might have people. I do think in person provides a context, ability to read people, and a kind of additional dimension that can really help a lot that we can't get through either Zoom or audio. However, over the last year and a half, it would have been horrible without video conferencing. so in terms of technology, I think we'll probably see more people, especially companies and individuals. I'm very interested in hearing from Jason and Jerry, people from around the world that don't want to be flying around to have a meeting. So that, obviously this is terrific for that. And I was thinking of like Camp David Accords and some of the Good Friday agreements and so forth. They had lots and lots of meetings where they were in person. Although, President Biden just had some Zoom meetings with people over very important issues. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out. I'm still going to prefer in person, unless you have someone who's kind of got a psychological issue and in person is going to actually trigger them. What I'd like to see in the future, and it also raises some other issues like confidentiality and stuff when you're Zooming. What I'd like to see in the future, though, is a little more integration of ADR with regular dispute resolution paths, so that when people get stuck, especially if this wouldn't apply to a non-legal issue, but when there's a chance to get somebody to look at an issue and kind of be a trusted third party to give an opinion, and then the parties can take that back and do more negotiation. I think there should be a little more integration of that as a valuable tool, and not just people hashing it out and just arguing over opinions and feelings and stuff that could really work well, but sometimes they need a little bit of a kind of an unbiased opinion, and the mediator is not in a great position to be giving opinions like that. So it'd be nice if we had a little more integration between traditional dispute resolution and alternative dispute resolution if needed. That's the last thing I'll say.
Thank you, Jane. And I just, because of what you shared, I just feel like I have to jump in there. Lainey Feingold, who's a disability rights advocate, she and I recently had a conversation, and she was talking about the second edition of her book, which is Structured Negotiation, and how she's framed it and how it's been implemented since she's created this concept where when disputants in litigation reach an impasse and are unable or unwilling to or uninterested in pursuing litigation further, there's this still within the litigation proceedings, and litigation hasn't ended, but there's an opportunity to have what she calls structured negotiation. So it's still within the confines of the litigation proceedings, but at the same time, there is this structured negotiation proceeding where parties can, outside of court, seek this somewhat quasi-ADR based approach for reaching a settlement beyond the scope of the litigation proceeding. So that's kind of this exciting opportunity where it's the aspiration is to have it more normalized so that disputing parties don't have an expectation of going to the end of a litigation proceeding, but they can at least start it and at some point kind of go off in this structured negotiation proceeding, employing traditional ADR skill sets to reach an out-of-court agreement. So I think that's an exciting opportunity there. And I'll just stop there and hand it over. I think, Jason, you're next in the...
Sure. I guess in general to your question, I don't know what the future holds. It has been a fascinating, I guess about 2 years now in terms of how people have adapted. I think, among the changes is, at least that I've seen, is when there had been previously, very structured in-person meetings and things, it has really been a real quick adaptation in the field that I work in to being able to work online across different platforms. And I think that there's been a number of benefits to that. One would be that with the 9 months ago, the military initiated a coup in Myanmar, and everyone was trained on how to work online. So, and then there's a lot of, different forms of negotiation that have had to take place since then that wouldn't have been possible if those all had to take place in person when people are dispersed all across the country and hiding and around the world. So that's pretty fascinating. And I think those have also been much more inclusive processes because they're not geographically dependent or dependent on having resources to travel necessarily, although they're dependent on the info security issues and government internet shutdowns and things like that. So there's all sorts of other issues that come into play. But I think there are a lot of benefits to just having more ability to communicate and in different situations. The challenges that I still see are sort of like talking about sort of high level diplomacy and things like that would be relationship and trust building. I think it is a real challenge. When it's easier, I think, when we're talking over video and things to talk for a set period of time, it's much harder to, you're not going to just set up your video and talk for days on end as you might if you were to go on a retreat, perhaps, or have a weekend long meeting that includes lots of meals and tea breaks and things, where you can do more work to build relationships, and those can be really important things. So I think those are some of the I'm sure there's a lot of work being done to try to overcome those challenges, but I think those are some of the challenges that until we get to, I guess, sort of a mixed approach, hopefully soon, that the technology has some weaknesses as well.
So, Gary, since you are also in international ADR-based work, why don't you go next and maybe like what you agree or disagree with what Jason just shared could be helpful to you.
Yeah, I think it's a really incredibly exciting time looking ahead. And I say that because there are technologies and just for any participants, Geneva Peace Week is going on at the moment. There's some very interesting sessions there recorded also on digitizing nonviolent change processes, for example. But in terms of what we see coming is that, there's a few technologies that are being used, but they're actually being used to do what was already being done, but maybe in a more effective or more real-time way about engaging people and maybe working towards more inclusion. So they're interesting to a certain level to me, but what's really interesting is where technologies and behaviors can bring about fully new ways of thinking about ADR. And this is not like abstract or theoretical. And I'll give you the example is that, again, I'll use this Sudan. In Sudan, people brought around change that for 30 years, international efforts, including diplomacy, peace support efforts could not do. And one important element of that was a matchup of technology, WhatsApp groups, Facebook, to mobilize people in real time, communicate what was going on, and to match that with a behavior which we're seeing more commonly, which is that people are taking matters more into their own hands. And because, this word floats around a lot, you can think of it as a kind of a disintermediation of people bringing change. They're not locked into their politicians like they were before. And this is the same in Black Lives Matter. It's in Lebanon, or because I used to work in Iraq, it was fascinating to see that people who historically had very different ideological orientations were coming together on an issue of common concern and organizing around that, which was the extent of corruption in the government. So looking ahead, we see a lot of potential for technologies to help engender new behaviors. And some of those are more horizontal efforts, not necessarily vertical. It's not going to be, and this is really interesting change in COVID, is that previously there'd be a lot of mediators flying around the world supporting different processes. The absence of that and the limitations of Zoom have meant that there's more responsibility taken on by national mediation efforts. And that's a really, really good thing. And then the last point is you're going to get really kind of looking ahead a little bit. We talk to people right now on internet broadband, satellite internet broadband. And that's really important because in Sudan right now, or Ethiopia, when things get tough, as two examples, or even Myanmar, in those contexts, there are certain authorities at the moment that have their hand on the communication switch, either the internet itself or particular applications like WhatsApp. In the future, it's going to be much more difficult for any authorities to do that because of cheaper satellite internet. And then the very last point is that big problem in ADR for us is implementation of agreements, seeing them through to the end. And there's a lot of technologies coming that can help in that way to give more incentive to parties and others and more accountability to stick with them. And some of those I would just mention are more automatic smart contracts. Anyway, that's a lot already there. Thank you.
Super interesting, Jerry. And like, just to connect what you shared earlier around what you find empowering or rewarding in your work to what you just shared right now, you've viewed your work as so valuable because you got to empower people to prevent conflict on their own. And I'm hearing this line continuing from that about how you view technology about as valuable as in being able to empower individuals and communities to organize themselves on issues that they care about, to kind of hold people above them, institutions above them, accountable for their actions. So that's also really interesting. So thank you, Jerry. And we'll have to talk with what you just, the last piece on smart contracts and how they can hold the institutions accountable, because that's super interesting too. Chandra.
I'm learning so much. So I think I was talking to the future earlier today when I was in the 7th grade. So I will give you the the news. I wondered to myself, when we let kids specialize in violent videos, who's going to take part in these ADR opportunities? I worked with the federal government after Columbine on the Safe and Drug-Free Schools grant. And I got flown all over the country to get trained in all of these violence prevention tactics and techniques. But I was also sent to a lot of conferences, which this was from 2000 to 2003, where we were warned about what would happen if what was going on with the violent videos at the time, and how it connected to empathy development in children. And they were like, in 20 years, it's gonna be, and here we are 20 years later, and they were right. And I, myself and my partner that I was on the grant with, we would say, hey, we have to do these different things. We have to like build empathy in kids, and teachers were like, we have MCAS to do. Don't bother us with that. So I never forgot the science, and that's where I am now, is that I'm bringing a lot of that science of building empathy into schools. We were, it was a well-funded grant. We got to be right there with the best of the best program developers, evaluators. The evaluators were here in, and I think they're in Newton, SSRE. They were the national evaluators. So we were having dinner with them every day and just like hanging out and being friends and learning so much about like where this was really gonna go. And I'm still in the same district. I left for a while, but I came back, but I'm seeing the results of what they're talking about. So I think about, I was very transfixed with what Jerry was talking about. I'm like, wow, yeah, that sounds neat, because those things are exciting to me. But when I think about, we do these things called stand-ups, and you stand up if you like this, you stand up if you like that. And how many of them, boys and girls, their favorite thing to do is play video games, and their favorite video games involve killing people, like always killing, getting rewarded for virtual killing. And what we were told was, if you see over 500 fake murders, that's like one real murder for your brain. That's what we were told at these conferences. So that's worrisome to me, because I think this transcends race, class, gender, and some of the teachers too. So I don't know if they'll have the patience for ADR, But on the other hand, I'm a Libra, so I'm going to give you both sides. I went and spent a week in Northern California on a Native American reservation, the Yurok tribe. After watching the movie Tribal Justice, I met Judge Abby Abernathy at the law school, at the Harvard Law School, and she said, "You got to come out to the reservation and with me, and see what kind of trouble we can get into." So I went out there and I sat in court for 5 days, and on the way back, I learned so much. It was like my head was heavy. And we're driving the 6-hour trip back to San Francisco. And she said, "Chandra, you have to get them to go back to their villages." And I was like, no, that's never going to work, because that's how I always act. I'm always like, no. But what I've seen since I've come back, that was in 2017, and the training that I'm doing in restorative justice and the implementation of restorative justice, I'm seeing myself that people, human beings around me in Cambridge, are trying to sit down and have the conversations like Jerry was talking about. Forget about just the differences. Let's get together and sit down and be in circle and talk to the people we don't like and build community. And I'm more able since COVID to sell the idea that community building as a preventative act is something that they should take time to do. So in the schools, the teachers, the administrators, the high-level administrators, they have become much more willing to sit down and listen and just do the trust building necessary. We have to do trust building internally. That's part of restorative justice. And people are like, what? Oh, before we start talking, we just have to reflect on a poem? Okay, then they do it. And they realize that they're getting to know their coworkers better. And that makes it easier to work with those coworkers. This is all science that came from safe and drug-free schools, but you have to kind of bring it in a package that people like. And so on one hand, I am very worried about the content that the kids are consuming. And then on the other hand, for myself, I'm seeing more yeses, more let's spend more time doing this. Let's sit down more. So I can't say one way or the other. I think hopefully I'll be there to witness it.
Thank you, Chandra. And I feel like your Libra instincts is highlighting how, the duality of technology, the good and bad that's within technology. With video games, you can see, as you described, the violent content that's promoted there. And then with what Jerry was mentioning earlier with social media, you can see how technology can be used to hold institutions accountable in ways that was much, much more difficult historically. So I'm hearing this Libra duality from what you just shared. And maybe in terms of thinking about skills that are important for students and attendees to be thinking about, from what you all have just shared, I'm hearing that technological competence is so critical for what the future, whatever the future holds, that it's going to have greater integration of technology into some of what we view as alternative dispute resolution today. And then circling back to Chandra's comment on emotional intelligence, even in these technologically based systems, there is still a strong demand and need for emotionally intelligent people to operate, to be able to build trust in virtual spaces. So I think those are two skills that those listening today can think about for the future, whether it's 5 years or 20 years from now, that these will be recurring skills that will be valuable. So I have one final question, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&As from attendees. And the final question is really identifying that many of the students that we interact with are going to graduate into environments that love the cat. Sorry, they're gonna graduate into environments that may be different from alternative dispute resolution. They may graduate into environments that are more law firm based, more nonprofit based. And so my question for you all is, when we're thinking about transitioning from non-ADR into ADR, what advice could you give attendees on how they can on how they can make that transition as seamless as possible. And I'll just open it up since we were kind of shuffled up in terms of who goes and who speaks.
Okay, I can start. I think one thought to share is that to attendees is beware of the handcuffs. The handcuffs are the things you get into in a career track, in a corporate environment, whatever it is. And at some point, if you're not careful, it starts to bind you into a track that gets more difficult to get out of at some point. You might go in and say, well, I'll do this for 4 or 5 years. I'll pay off my student loans and then I'll go and do something else. So number one piece of advice is beware of the handcuffs. Number 2 and 3 pieces of advice is there's a few traits you've got to keep close no matter what work you're doing. And then you'll gravitate in there if you're sufficiently interested. You'll find your way. But those 1 or 2 traits, I'd say the top 2 are curiosity, humility. Keep those open, no matter what you're doing. If you're doing it as a track to get somewhere else, keep those open in your mind. There's others about persistence and patience, all of those. But curiosity, being curious about why people are acting in a certain way, and be humble. And that'll serve you well. And then if you really are sufficiently energized, passionate about finding a career in ADR, you'll find it sooner or later. But just beware of the handcuffs, because the handcuffs, they do what they're supposed to do. They tie your hands for a while, and you get used to a certain type of track. It can be hard to get out of it. And I say that because not only in Cambridge, but I can't tell you how many people have said to me, wow, I really love the work you're doing. I wish I'd be able to do that, except X. I'm on this career path. I'm up for partner. I'm in a big firm that pays a certain amount. So sorry, I'll stop there. Beware of the handcuffs, because they do what they're supposed to do.
Jerry, I agree with you so much. I went dodging certifications. I took all the courses to become a teacher, but I didn't get certified. I took all the courses to become a clinician, but I didn't get certified. And those handcuffs were waiting for me in so many different places, like, oh, just work here. You could get certified later. And I'm so glad that I did not fall into those traps. So I just want to co-sign exactly what you're saying. I have been the first person to do every job that I'm doing, that I've done for the past, I don't know how many years. Like, it just pops up, nobody's done it, and I'm the first person. So I like that mentality. It's a value. And so I would say values-based practices. And again, I'm quoting Judge Abby Abernathy, her advice. And I think if I had to do a job that was not aligned with my personal principles, I think I would feel like I was in handcuffs. That would kill me. So I think that I just did what I really, really think is what needs to happen, and in job after job. So this particular job, I said that I'm going to do this job for 3 years, and then I'm going to go on and do something else. And what happened was this job opened up, and I went from being a mediator to also being able to do restorative justice and do many things. So I would say, when you look at a job that you want, make sure it has versatility in it so that you can meet a variety of needs if that's what you like, or be narrow if that's what you like. I have the opportunity to work with parents, students, the police, the hospitals, the courts. I get to go everywhere. So that matches my value system. So I would say the same thing as Jerry. Don't get caught like, oh, this is making a lot of money. You will never be able to leave. Great advice, Jerry.
I'm thinking about those who are lawyers or some other job that's not ADR, and you're saying people who want to transition into ADR. If that's, first of all, I think I've taught mediation and negotiation for a long time, and I doubt if very many of those people in the mediation class become mediators, but I feel that they're going to be so much more effective lawyers. And in many cases, until recently, they probably know more about it than their bosses. They're going to be able to be effective advocates in mediation, which is more and more a tool that a lawyer has to help both litigation disputes, but also even deal disputes when you're trying to build a contract or construction or environmental situations that break down. But I would say, let's say you want to get into ADR, I'd kind of approach it like a dispute systems design problem where, okay, what do I want? Where am I interested in? Who are the stakeholders? What problems do they have? What can I do to kind of learn more about them and their interests and their needs? And then how can I start helping? You might be able to get a job, but you might also be able to start helping and then become hireable because you do such a good job. If you can manage doing some volunteer, or there's so many ways, I can't even define it because there's so many things you could do. But now that I've been around for a long time and I've hired people and I've supervised people and stuff, it's the people who have the passion and interest and do a good, put themselves into it. That's who we want to have around. So if you're that person, if you're finding a field that's really some part of ADR that really interests you, I would say just like do what you can to pursue it. And even if you don't find a job, because this field is hard to find a job in as easily as you can find a traditional law job, you could possibly create something for yourself. So I would just like use your creativity, your brainstorming that you learned in mediation for yourself, and you can maybe talk it over with a few friends.
I'll agree with everybody, and just add. So if you see yourself on the path to be starting out at a law firm or something similar, I agree. I think there's lots of ADR related work probably that you might be able to find either directly within a firm or ways to build the relevant skills. So I would encourage you to think about, it depends on the firm and the practice areas. It might not be the practice areas your friends are focused on, but think about which ones are ones that would let you get those skills, or find the pro bono work that lets you do that. And then there's lots of other, maybe softer skills, but just thinking about how to understand your clients really well and things like that. So I think first of all that, and then second of all, if you are really passionate about something and where you want to end up or what your first choice dream job is, pursue that. I would say that, I would say whatever it is that you try to pursue the thing that you think is going to make you happiest, at any stage.
Thank you, everyone. So there's this, I just have to share this. There's this really powerful quote from Seneca, actually, and he wrote, "Putting things off is the greatest waste of life. It snatches away each day as it comes, and it denies us the present by promising us the future." I think there's a certain element of that I'm hearing there. When the opportunity presents itself, and it isn't necessarily always present, but when it does present itself, be prepared to snatch it. So with that, I wanted to shift over to questions from attendees. And there are a couple here. So the first that I wanted to ask, one of the attendees asked, first off, thanked everyone for being available tonight, and wanted to circle back to the piece around curiosity and humility that Jerry mentioned. And the question is to ask, to share an example from each of your own careers of a time that you were driven to a particular project or role because of your curiosity for it.
I can volunteer for this if that's helpful. Curiosity. For us, we have a program now which is supporting people in Somalia, and it's been active for 12 years. But that whole program started, it started because we saw at that time there was some work ongoing to mediate between the central government and the Somali equivalent of our states here in the US. They're called federal member states. They're like the states here. And there's one state in one region in the North, Somaliland, which has been seeking independence for 23 years or so. And this was not included in any way in any of these mediations. And my curiosity said, that just doesn't seem like that's going to work in the long term. Is that how it can be? And I got very curious about that. And I also got curious about, like, how is it that these deals are being made? I don't see many people's voices beyond these kind of political elite in there. So I had two questions. That was in 2009. And out of that, we built a program which has been active now for those 12 years. And out of that, it's been, let's say, at a local level, we've supported establishment of district peace committees, because we had this question originally: how are people engaged in? And when we say ADR, please be open that the A can have a lot of traditional types of dispute resolution. And in Somalia here, we're supporting people to bring a kind of a hybrid of Somali traditional approaches and then like more like contemporary ADR approaches. And that came out of questions like not engaging Somaliland in a dialogue. That doesn't seem like that's going to work. Let's try and find out more about that. So that's one example from my side.
So I was asked to be part of this program called Stopwatch when I first started my job. And I was like, ew, no, I don't want to do that. So I wasn't curious at all. And then I went. And it was this program by the MBTA police where staff from schools hung out at the train station and downtown crossing, and pairs of people had clipboards, and we would interview people who were supposed to be in school. And after the interview, they could get a free ride back to school. And the lieutenant said, I'm curious, what if we use your mediators to mediate young people who get arrested on the MBTA? And I was like, are you kidding me? I'm curious about that too. So for 10 years, we have been providing mediation and restorative opportunities for victims of crime on the MBTA. And there has been zero recidivism. And I always hesitate when I say that because it's gonna happen, I guess. But we, from assault and battery to robbery, if the victim wants a mediation and doesn't want to go to court, students from CRLS come to the MBTA police station and mediate. If it's an adult victim and a minor as the perpetrator, I will mediate with a teenager and we'll get it resolved to the victim's satisfaction. I think the most curious thing to me is people have no idea what to ask for when they can't go, send them to jail. But it's such a fun experience to say, okay, what do you think this person deserves for stealing from you or from assaulting you? Let's have that conversation when, just me and them. Let's go through your whole story. So I go back every single time because I'm so curious to hear the story of the victim. Why do they want to come and be face to face instead of going to court with the perpetrator and really find out why? Maybe they get their stuff back. But that is my most curious thing, and it's been very rewarding.
Thank you, Chandra. So we have so many questions from the attendees coming in now, so little time. So I wanted to jump to another question. Going back to what we talked about earlier around how the alternative sometimes means that there is a fresh path that is being taken that didn't exist before an initiative was actually championed. And the attendee asking the question asks how you determine the best practices for that role that didn't previously exist, or when there isn't institutional knowledge around dealing with that particular instance. How do you determine that best practice, basically?
Was
Are you
that for me?
talking? Yeah, I wasn't sure what the question meant. You mean new ADR work to do, or new ADR jobs, or?
Yeah, so when you are in a role that didn't exist before, a new role, or in an institution that didn't exist before, a new institution, or conducting skills or objectives that didn't exist prior, how do you identify the best practices on what you should do, or what the institution should do? Yeah.
I will say it is a nightmare. You have to have a very, very strong personality. You have to stay focused on your job, the job that you have, because everybody will try to get you to do 100 other things because, like you said, there's no previous experience. I've done this repeatedly, and I've just seen people, they want to put you into a traditional place. They want me to do discipline. They want me to do criminal justice. And I'm like, nah, I don't do that. So I would say that is one of the most challenging things that comes along with being the first person to do a job, and especially if it's not traditional. My job, there's the superintendent, there's the deputy superintendent who does academics, and then there's the CEO for facilities and buildings. And then there's a dotted line that goes over to the side and it says conflict mediator. So I'm not in the union, I'm not supervised by anyone. People can't wrap their mind around this, but I stick with voluntary, confidential, non-judgmental, self-directed, and future-oriented. And that just keeps me just focused on what I do, and I do not try to stray for any purpose, no matter how much I like people, away from those principles.
I guess I could add, I've worked most of my time since graduating law school in a position that didn't exist previously before the nonprofit I now direct. Most of my work was fully as an independent consultant, but serving basically as an embedded advisor to negotiators and political leaders. And so not as a mediator, but as a negotiation advisor. And I think the key, and in a highly political situation also. So the key for me was ethical considerations, and thinking about although it's in a foreign jurisdiction, but thinking about the ethical duties that I would want to be bound by, and having a clear transparency and trusting communications with the people I'm working with, so that those are very clear. And then certainly having people that you can talk to about how you would want to structure relationships and the work you're doing as well, that are reliable and trustworthy, to help you navigate challenging moments or figuring out how to navigate those situations.
I would just add that we often find ourselves in situations where we're supporting processes or the paths towards forming new institutions where something did not exist before. And in those situations, we often are guided by a few things. Some of the colleagues have mentioned them, obviously, an ethical approach, values, that's an incredibly important kind of guiding star. But we also look to what has worked previously in the context you're working in. What has worked there, and maybe it's a different type of institution, but elements can be taken out of that. And then you definitely want to look at what has not worked there in the past. You want to look at comparatives, but you want to take them into the context setting. And the reason I say that is because if I had to sit through another part of a kind of a preparation for a peace negotiation, talking about federalism and using the Swiss or the Canadian model and how that could work in South Sudan, I mean, I'll go crazy. You got to take these comparatives, but bring them into the context. And that's a really important part of what we're discussing is knowing enough about why people are in dispute in the first place in their context setting to understand what could be helpful. And very frankly, I've seen enough cases of things that are unhelpful, that actually push the parties further apart. And there's a lot of sensitivity around that part. So looking at what has worked in the past in the context and looking at what could work and taking lessons from elsewhere. And that goes back to my point. Keep your mind open. You know, in Ireland, we say that there's a reason we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You know, you should listen more and talk less. Just hear people's voices of what has worked in their context and be careful of those who might want to have something in place, but for reasons that are not for the benefit of resolving the conflict.
Beautifully said, beautifully said. So before we go into the Zoom mixer rooms where attendees can interact directly with each of our stellar panelists, I did want to ask one final question from the attendees. And it kind of builds off of or relates to Jerry's last points around talking less and listening more. So the attendee asks that in different ADR classes, organizations, there's the talk of the role of culture and how it influences approaches to alternative dispute resolution. And the attendee says, I'm curious if the panelists could speak on their experience doing ADR work while navigating different cultures and how they shifted or adapted their approach. Great question.
Well, the culture of school is to compete. So I came as one person going in the complete opposite direction. Everything is hierarchical in school. Literally, it's so front facing, and yet it's so front facing that we don't talk about it. We act like, oh, we're all just people here. Seniors in high school are the same as kindergarten. So when I come into my context, I am the only person who's like, let's even out the playing field. And that is it can be wearing on you. So I would say one of the things that I do for myself is I hang around with a whole lot of mediators that are everywhere outside of my school district. I'm involved in every mediation thing I can do to keep myself feeling confident and like aligned, and that what I'm saying and doing isn't crazy. I will say that it's bringing that's a cultural conflict right there. I will say as well, part of trust building, they're not used to spending time doing that. They're like, oh, I'm a teacher. We just came back to school and we're having all these outbursts in the classes. And I go, oh, did you ask them anything about like what it felt like being at home? And then what it feels like being in school now, and what, do they like it or no? They started school. They came in and they were like, math, because there was an expectation of trust. You trust the school, you trust the teachers, you just fall into place. And that's not real anymore. So I think that I happen to be in a space where people are pushing back. So people are willing to spend the time doing the trust building. But I have to say, when I was on the reservation, I went to a meeting with judges and lawyers that were Native judges and lawyers and US judges and lawyers. And at the beginning of the meeting, this man sauntered to the front, this Native American guy, he had the turquoise and the vest, and he told a 30-minute story. And I was like, oh my gosh, when is this story gonna end? How are we doing this? Isn't this a meeting? What's going on? Why is this storytelling happening? And I feel like I missed a lot of the story because I was so in my US context of what a meeting is supposed to look like. And all these people, US and Native Americans, were like so relaxed, listening to his story, just absorbing it. I think you have to still work on making what you do normative. You kind of have to still try to make what you do, because what I saw at that meeting was that's the complete other end. That's where they have just given it up. They're like, the Native Americans have to tell a long story at the beginning. We're not gonna start this meeting without that. So they have that. I have to try to make people think more, less competitively. And so of course, They don't, ADR is not their thing. They want to suspend and they want to fight and they want to go to grievance, and that's their first thought. So little by little, by being a strong personality, I think you can get people to maybe think more about as much about ADR as the traditional ways of managing conflict. I believe there's hope.
All right, well, I'm going to make a comment on that. Culture seems to be incredibly important in how people approach negotiation, and also what they mean by what they say. And yeah, if I don't know about whatever the cultural background is that this individual is coming from, I'm not necessarily going to understand all of what they're trying to say, or I can't maybe read the meaning behind the words so well. So the first step for me is just become aware. And I had to learn that through it coming out in various mediations and me realizing what was going on. And one of the things, I don't think it would be in the write-up, but I came to Harvard to go to divinity school because I wanted to understand how religious and spiritual values affect negotiation behavior. And I learned a lot about culture at divinity school. And I've been studying aspects of it. I don't know if I'll ever know enough. I mean, I'm not going to have time the rest of my life to live in every culture, but I think the thing that I've learned through the research on culture is that knowing that I don't know is pretty important, and then finding a way to have a conversation about culture as part of the dispute resolution proceeding. And then we can use our skills, the same skills we use to resolve like a legal dispute, we can use to communicate about cultural preferences or differences or meanings. And so it's something that I started out, I'm older than maybe a lot of people. I started out with the North American model of business mediation. And we soon found out that was a pretty narrow view of how to resolve disputes. And so I'm still doing legal disputes, but even though I work for the US government, there's people from all over, just the South and North of the US is different cultures, different religious backgrounds, different ethnic heritages, and all that, city, rural, all different cultures. So it's important to just be aware and curious about it, as Jerry was saying, and humble about it, as Jerry was saying.
Beautiful. So I think that's a great place to end things on the curiosity and humility as we engage in the work that we love to do and aspire to do for the future. With that, I wanted to thank all of our panelists and also share, as Jess has included in the chat box below, a Zoom link where you can all interact directly with our amazing panelists. And maybe we can just end things off with a little celebration. Here we are. Awesome. So thank you all. And we can now migrate over to the Zoom box. Jess, what would you add there?
Oh, nothing. I was just going to say, I posted a link. So if you're going to join the session, I'll see you in a new Zoom. Thank you again to all the panelists.
Bye, everyone. See you in the other Zoom room.